Hello, and welcome to the virtual recording studio here at Penn State Law. I'm your host, Mandee Baumer, and joining me in the studio today is Nicole Chong. Nicole and I are both legal writing professors here at Penn State Law. I've been teaching in our first year legal writing program for just 3 years, so I'm rather new. Let's call me a novice teacher. Nicole, on the other hand, has been teaching for 15 years, so she's very experienced. Let's call her a veteran teacher. Nicole and I are here today to discuss how novice teachers and veteran teachers can work together in a mentoring relationship, and then how that mentoring relationship can help both of them thrive at the various stages of their teaching career. But before we dive into that topic, Nicole, why don't you explain how our legal writing program is structured?
Sure, Mandee, I would be happy to. So Penn State Law has a 2-semester program for first-year analysis and writing. We have 3 credits in the fall for objective writing, and then 2 credits in the spring for persuasive writing, and then we also have a separate legal research class. Most relevant to this presentation is that our legal analysis and writing program is a coordinated one. So what that means is that we have all of our major curricular decisions coordinated across all legal writing sections. So for instance, all legal writing sections use the same syllabus and course rules and textbook. We also use the same practice writing problems and the same graded closed and open writing problems. Also for those writing problems, we have the same due dates and page limits. Further, all sections also follow the same class schedule. Each legal writing professor may tailor how they teach a particular subject matter, such as how much lecture to do, what PowerPoints to use, if any, and what in-class exercises to do. However, we all teach the same topic on any given day.
I'm grateful that we have a coordinated program because that means that I don't have to create all of the course content from scratch. But as a novice teacher, I still have a lot of work to do to get ready to teach. For example, I really should be familiar with pedagogy and best teaching practices. And then while I'm teaching, I need to be prepared for what happens in the classroom while my students are interacting. And then after teaching, I need to manage my time wisely and fulfill all of my various academic responsibilities. That's a lot of work. And as a novice teacher, I struggled with knowing which task to prioritize, how much time to devote to each task, and how to juggle all of the out-of-class responsibilities. Fortunately for me, I had Nicole to turn to for advice, and she really helped me through the first few years of teaching. During today's broadcast, I'll share with you some of the most pressing questions I asked of Nicole. Nicole will share with you the answers she gave me. I'll share with you how I implemented some of her advice, and then together we'll explain how this mentoring relationship benefited both of us. So let's get started. We all know that a novice teacher can't just show up on the first day of classes and teach the course content well. A novice teacher really should understand some pedagogical concepts before entering the classroom. Here are 2 pedagogy-related questions that I asked of Nicole when I first started teaching. Question number 1. I've been a practicing attorney for decades, and writing has become so intuitive for me. How do I get back to the basics of legal writing and start at the beginning where my students will be?
Well, I can recall when I was first hired, which seems like an awfully long time ago, but I had happened to have kept my legal writing textbook from law school. And so when I was first hired, I flipped through that book and I was looking at things that I had highlighted, such as what the definition was of a rule. And it's hard to believe, I guess, that I didn't know what a rule was way back then, but that really helped me to put things into perspective. So my first tip would be to make sure to review the legal writing textbook and other materials from a viewpoint of where you were back when you were a first-year law student. And a second tip would be to recognize that many of the cases that you may have handled in practice are simply going to be too complex for 1L writing problems and exercises. So especially for the fall semester, try to limit writing problems and exercises to first-year topics. And I also found that bar prep books were useful just as a reminder of some of those 1L course topics and subtopics.
A related question I asked of Nicole about pedagogy is related to the flipped classroom. I went to law school many, many years ago, and all of my classes were lecture only. Law school seems so different now with a flipped classroom, especially in skills courses. I understand conceptually what the flipped classroom is, but how do I convince my students that it's a good way to learn legal writing? In other words, how do I get students to flip over the flipped classroom?
Well, Mandee, of course, we know that legal writing as a skills course, lecturing is not the most effective delivery method. So as with any skill, legal writing is learned by doing. And so practice and critique and reflection are some of the tools that legal writing faculty use. So as you know, when a flipped classroom is used, it moves the lecture out of the classroom to make room for class time for workshopping writing. And so class time can be used for looking at students' practice assignments, reviewing what worked well and what didn't work well, and having students translate that workshop into reflecting on their own practice assignment. To get student support for this method, you need to start early with explaining how the class time will be spent in most of the classes. So you can use analogies to their lives before law school where they had to learn and master a skill. For example, how did they become a good piano player or a strong tennis player or something along those lines? And relatedly, you can build in some mindset tips. Explain that everyone in the class has the capability to learn and do well in legal writing, but keeping an open mind and a positive attitude is certainly important. Everyone will make mistakes, but students need to hang in there and continue to learn from that feedback. Finally, because of the intensive feedback the flipped classroom provides, students begin to see that the professor is working just as hard as they are. So you can try to align yourself with the students. Agree to put in 110% in providing the feedback and all of the tools they need to succeed if they do the same in return in regard to the effort they put into their assignments. Of course, there will be those resistant students who just want the professor to give them the answers. But over time, most students will begin to see why the flipped teaching method works well for skills courses.
Selling the flipped classroom to the students is indeed challenging. What also can be challenging for a novice teacher is knowing how to manage the classroom dynamics. I had multiple questions related to what do I do if a student says a particular thing in class or does a particular thing in class? And here's a sample of some of the questions that I asked Nicole. Scenario number 1, I'm delivering course content and one student interjects to tell a personal story that's not related to what we're discussing in class. How do I redirect the misdirected student?
Well, Mandee, we all know that there's always at least one difficult student, right? So it's important to really set the tone early in your class. The class time needs to be on point in order to be effective. So if a student is a frequent interrupter and often takes the class down tangents, you can positively redirect that student, even if you need to interrupt the student. You can say something like, that sounds like an interesting anecdote, and I would be happy to hear more about that outside of class time. But in the meantime, let's get back to whatever your topic is for that day.
I now have a go-to response that I give in that situation, and I'll say, let's table that discussion for now, and if you would like to resume it, please come to my office hours and I'll be happy to discuss it with you there then. Let's talk about another common scenario that often happens in the classroom. I've asked a student a question and the student responds with a wildly incorrect answer. How do I gently correct the incorrect student?
Well, certainly, we're happy that students are answering questions, but if the student is answering a question and is incorrect with the answer, that could be problematic. So one technique you could use is to ask the student why the student thinks that the answer is correct. And you might be able to see easily the flaw in the student's reasoning, and you also might end up seeing that other students are similarly lost. So you can also open the dialogue and ask for other students' answers. Students will see how respectful debate and differences of opinions in that open dialogue are really useful between colleagues. Ultimately, though, it's up to the professor to respectfully guide the class to the correct or the best answer.
Opening up a class dialogue is definitely a great tip. But as a novice teacher, I have to be cognizant of how much time each little dialogue is taking in each class period. So I need to be the timekeeper and the facilitator both at the same time. Final question related to what happens in the classroom while you're teaching is this. I ask the whole class a question, but the same 4 students volunteer to answer every time. I know that I can cold call the other 30 students in my class, but I'm a little nervous about doing that, and my students certainly seem nervous too. So, how do I take the chill out of cold calling?
I will admit, Mandee, this is one of the hardest things that I found as a new professor. And honestly, I still struggle with this sometimes. But I think it's just important to recognize that the professor needs to take control of the classroom. And the more students who are involved, the better the classroom dynamic. And you don't want students to accuse you of favoritism by calling on the same students over and over. And also students quickly get tired of those students who are constantly answering the questions. That could cause other students to actually disengage. So my tip is to just simply force yourself out of your comfort zone and start to call on students. While you may not feel comfortable with this at first, the results certainly end up paying off. Students will be more prepared for class because they fear they might get called on. Further, you'll begin to get more volunteers because students will volunteer for the easy questions so that they don't get cold called on the harder questions. Also, to do this, you can foster an environment where a student can simply answer with "I don't know," and hopefully that student then will be more prepared the next time. But you can also foster an environment where it's okay to get an answer wrong. And that open dialogue that I mentioned can help students to feel more comfortable with speaking up in class. You might also consider using group work and assigning spokespersons for each class to take some of the pressure off of individual students.
All of Nicole's advice was instructive for how to manage what happens during classroom instruction time. But as a novice teacher, I also needed some help managing my time outside of class. So let's next discuss some questions I asked of Nicole about grading and conferencing with students. First question. I know that I should be giving my students feedback on the substantive content of their memos and briefs. I also know that I should be giving students feedback on their technical writing skills. Oh, and I also know I should be giving feedback on their citation skills and on the formatting of their documents. So, given all this feedback, how do I not spend 8 hours grading each student's paper?
That question is certainly a great question. The feedback and critiquing can be absolutely overwhelming. So first, and probably most importantly, keep in mind that you are no longer a practitioner who is tasked with editing a piece of writing for filing. Instead, you are the professor, not an editor. And that means you must give feedback for the students to learn from. So to help with this, you can prioritize your feedback on the biggest problems on the writing. So for example, a substantive or analytical error might be more important to provide feedback on than a comma problem. If you do need to provide feedback on many different things, both substantive and technical, you can make a comment only 1 or 2 times for each error. So for instance, if a student makes the same comma error over and over, make a comment about that relevant comma rule, and then perhaps fix 1 or 2 sentences with that error. Then you can tell the student that this error occurs frequently throughout the document and advise the student to continue to look for an edit for the error and certainly come see the professor, of course, if they have further questions on that error. Secondly, you can develop a comment bank that you can use for any assignment as well as a comment bank tailored to each individual assignment. And this way you can have comments ready to cut and paste into the individual assignments without having to recreate the wheel for every paper.
My first instinct when I first started giving feedback on papers was simply to say to students, this is incorrect for this reason. But when Nicole shared her comment bank with me, I saw how she gave gentle corrective feedback. And once I started implementing some more gentle corrective feedback and the feedback I provided to my students were more receptive to it. Let's move to the next question. Let's assume that I've graded all the papers and I've returned them to the students, but one student is emotionally distraught about the grade. How do I console the inconsolable student?
That's certainly never an easy situation. But if the student is upset, you can direct the student to focus on the feedback, not the grade. Direct the student to the biggest issues with the writing and let the student know that you're there to help fix those issues so that the student can improve. You can also try to put things in perspective where legal writing is not a course where the grade hinges on only one exam. So students have several chances to improve their grade. But to do so, they must reflect on the professor's feedback and apply that feedback on the next assignment. Some gentle reminders about growth mindset often can be helpful as well. Finally, you can give graded assignments back several days before you will agree to meet with students on that assignment. So for example, you could hand back grades on a Friday afternoon and then start conferences to review the assignment on Monday. And by doing so, you automatically build in reflection time so that upset or any other emotions can be diffused by the time you see students about a graded assignment.
That cooling off period after you return the grades is really important. But let's say that the cooling off period doesn't work for a particular student, and the student is actually quite livid about the grade that he or she received. How do I diffuse the angry over my grade student?
That's, I think, probably a more difficult situation even than when you have an upset student. And fortunately, I think that's a situation that doesn't happen as often. But one of the things you can do if a student is so angry or defensive that the student won't or just simply can't listen, you can consider sending the student away and ask the student to make an appointment for a future date. This gives the student time to cool off. But you can tell the student that you are there to help with improving their writing, but you can't do that if the student isn't really hearing what you're saying. So asking the student to review the feedback again before coming in for a future appointment can be useful.
So many things to remember and so many things to do as a teacher. I would have really floundered my first few years of teaching had I not had Nicole to turn to for advice. Two big benefits to me from having her as my mentor were the following. First, she made my job more manageable. I learned some valuable shortcuts from her so that I wouldn't overspend my time on certain tasks. She also taught me what tasks to prioritize so that I would do the highest priority task first. Second, she shared her episodic knowledge with me. Having been in the classroom for 15 years, she really had heard almost everything a student could say. And so when she told me how she responds when a student says a particular thing, that gave me a base of knowledge that I could use and take into the classroom with me when I was confronted with a student saying something similarly.
That mentor-mentee relationship had benefits to me as well as the veteran teacher. Two benefits jump out at me, and first is that I really was able to have a fresh set of eyes on the material so that I could see where my materials needed to be updated or freshened up or improved in some ways. I also was able to get new ideas from the novice professor. Mandee was implementing my advice and improving on some of my ideas and coming up with her own in-class workshop ideas and handouts and that sort of thing. So I was able to get some brand new ideas, and that helped me, was another way that I was able to freshen up my own material. I also think the mentor-mentee relationship has benefits to the entire legal writing program as well. Because of the new professor's questions, many of which were pedagogical in nature, I really began to review why the program made certain curricular choices over the years, which then led me to think about whether any changes should be made going forward.
Last, we discovered that our program had a wealthy bank of institutional knowledge. And we realized that we really ought to be preserving this knowledge and passing it on to other people in our program. And specifically, we realized that this knowledge would be valuable for any new people coming into our program because our bank of institutional knowledge could help acclimate them very quickly to our program. That's all the time we have for today. Nicole and I have so enjoyed discussing with you our mentoring relationship and the benefits we received from having this mentoring relationship. We consulted numerous sources about the stages of the teaching process and about mentoring when we were preparing to give this presentation. Here is a short list of some of the sources that we consulted.
If you have any questions or comments about this presentation, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.